Today in the United States, marijuana has become a cultural phenomenon, with one economic analysis paper citing that it accounted for $4 billion for the farm sector, $8 billion for the food, beverage, and tobacco manufacturing sector, and $37 billion for the retail sector in 2019. It's found in foods like these, drinks like these, glasses like these, and even miscellaneous items you wouldn't even think would have it. And of course, one of the most common ways to use marijuana, one of these. Today in the US, in 19 states it is recreationally available, and in 38 states it has been legalized for medical use. However, it took a long time for American culture and politics to change so that this could occur. And a big reason for why this change was so slow is because of the stigma of drug use in the United States. So, does the legalization of marijuana help the stigma or harm it? The first time a stigma emerged for marijuana users in the United States was around 1900 when Mexican immigrants started getting stereotyped for their marijuana use. Due to the civil war in Mexico at this time, many immigrants came to the US to escape. And then with no evidence, many in the US started to stereotype them and associate them with marijuana. As a result, many propaganda campaigns were started that linked minorities like Mexicans to violence, as well as drug use. One popular belief is that these actions were done to stop foreign labor from coming into the United States, and prohibition of alcohol didn't help this either. As a result of these stereotypes, many believed marijuana to be a drug that no one should ever use. Its dangers were blown out of proportion and it was associated with sin, like in this 1937 film called Reefer Madness. In this clip, one man goes crazy after consuming marijuana, showing that it provokes violent tendencies in people, which is in fact the opposite in marijuana. These stereotypes and propaganda led marijuana to be classified as a Schedule I narcotic in the US, meaning the DEA has deemed it as bad as heroin and LSD. So let's go back to 1937 with that clip from Reefer Madness. Back in those days, the stigma of marijuana was placed on sin. As a result of the media and the government propaganda, it was believed that people who used marijuana would go crazy and act on violent tendencies, just like in the propaganda depicting marijuana use in Mexican immigrants. In this film, several false side effects of using marijuana are depicted. In addition to the violence already shown, it depicts sexual misconduct and even outright unresponsiveness and memory loss as a result of using the drug. So, the stereotype of the modern marijuana user as lazy and unemployed has not yet been normalized, but instead, the stereotype is placed upon people who used to be functioning members of society, but tried marijuana, acted out, and destroyed their lives. Later, ads got slightly more realistic, but blew the impacts of using marijuana out of proportion. One other crucial point that goes along with the history of these PSAs is that the DARE program was created around this time, in 1983. As a result, many of these PSAs were DARE-backed or had some relation to the culture shifts caused by the DARE program. For example, the famous slogan to just say no to drugs. One important point to mention here is that all of these ads were being targeted to non-drug users. The goal of these PSAs is to stop potential drug users from taking drugs. However, no actions were being taken to help those who may be living in a high-poverty area, or who have already tried the substance. And this began to change the culture of how we view drug users, especially marijuana users, as many of them were depicted in a bad light. For example, in this 1980s ad where it depicts marijuana users as being burnouts.
There's something out there. It's after kids everywhere. It entices them, confuses them, and can even kill them. That's right. Illegal drugs are everywhere. Cocaine coaxes you in, and then when you least expect it, it grabs you. You're hooked, and it's hard to get away. And have you seen what marijuana does to some people? Oh yeah, you've seen them. Total burnouts. It slows you down. It softens your mind. And in my neighborhood, you need to move quickly and think fast. Drugs. It's a bloody shame.
This is your brain. And this is heroin. This is what happens to your brain after snorting heroin.
Eventually, more scare tactics began to emerge, and many ads would show the worst case scenario. Here, the speakers are very condescending and depict an unrealistic scenario of what would occur, alienating most of the audience. For example, in most of these "This is your brain on drugs" commercials, the speaker usually talks down to you. For example, in this clip here, when it implies that you should already know the information.
Is there anyone out there who still isn't clear about what doing drugs does? Okay, last time. This is your brain. This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
As a result of this approach, all of the drug users that may need help or want to reach out are deemed less important than stopping the spread of the quote-unquote epidemic of marijuana. Instead of laying out realistic results of what occurs, scare tactics are used, resulting in the culture of marijuana changing for the worse, because marijuana users are deemed as lesser people. For example, they are deemed as part of an experiment by this PSA here.
Young people from all walks of life have volunteered to take part in a frightening experiment. The most frightening part of this experiment is that it is not an experiment. It's what slowly happens to you when you keep smoking pot.
Another thing to note is that marijuana users were deemed as people that no one should ever talk to by many ads. Many ads said that you should stay away from people who use marijuana because they are a bad influence, which alienated many marijuana users. Now we reach the modern era of marijuana PSAs. What's important to note here is that this was right after marijuana was first legalized in Colorado. So here we see some patterns emerge for what happens after marijuana is first legalized, and how that changes the culture of marijuana use. Here, the stigma of marijuana use is very much still present. Those who use marijuana are still depicted as lazy and burnouts. However, the stereotypes are much less prevalent. As you have seen, in the past, marijuana users were being depicted as minority groups, who were often associated with violence and other means. Although, this has changed a bit as many marijuana users are being depicted as Caucasian males. For example, in this ad campaign from the state of Colorado on March 14th, informing people that while marijuana is now legal, they still need to ensure the safety of others. Another example comes from the same actress who portrayed the 1997 version of the Your Brain on Drugs commercial, Rachel Lee Cook. In this ad, the message goes against the war on drugs and against the criminalization of drugs in general. The important point of this ad, in terms of the stigma of marijuana, is that it states that the normal person takes drugs, but only some get caught, which very much normalizes its use.
This is someone else's family, someone else's life, someone who used drugs, but was never caught. This is how you feel! The war on drugs is ruining people's lives. It fuels mass incarceration. It targets people of color in greater numbers than their white counterparts. It cripples communities. It costs billions, and it doesn't work. Any questions?
As we have seen from these PSAs, the stigma of marijuana use is very much still here, but the situation is improving. And the legalization of marijuana is encouraging this effort because in these PSAs released to the public, it begins to depict the users as ordinary people, normalizing it into our culture. Instead of scaring people of the risks that may not exist, PSAs and ads are now informing the people of the importance of the issues that matter. For example, the message of the ads from the Colorado Department of Transportation saying that you should not drive under the influence of marijuana and what the risks are of that. What is also important to emphasize is that the legalization of marijuana has had mixed results to whether or not it increases use. For example, in these studies here showing the various different viewpoints and outlooks. And another study states that many people who could benefit from using medical marijuana are not using it or asking their doctors for it. Furthermore, although many stereotypes are still being used, other ads have strayed away from using them, opting for an approach with less stigma, where any average person could be a user of marijuana, reflecting that the legalization of marijuana has had a positive impact on the stigma of marijuana use in the United States.